I guess when you have no control, it might be the only card to play. You know? Can't say I would do it any differently. Just laugh it off. It's all you can do.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City of Winston-Salem Committee of the Whole of the City Council today. We will go ahead and call the order, and City Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Larson.
Present.
Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Councilmember Mundy.
Present.
Councilmember Scipio.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Here.
Councilmember Taylor.
Present.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Here.
And Councilmember Burke.
Thank you so much. We will go ahead and let us interim city manager Patrice Toney. She is basically going to facilitate this process today. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the City Council.
Good afternoon.
You can show the screen. Okay, so today we are going to review the possibility and opportunity for a housing trust fund. This is an initiative of the mayor, and a few of us, the chairs of the committees, had opportunities to visit a few of the cities, as well as the Affordable Housing Coalition. A few members participated to learn a little bit more about what this means and how this looks in communities. And so at the end, I'll create kind of a proposal for how it could look in Winston-Salem, and then you all give us some directives to go forward. I wanted to start by just mentioning what is a housing trust fund, and simply is a publicly financed program specifically designed to increase affordable housing. Many communities use it in different formats. I'll explain a little bit that this can be an internal special revenue fund. It can be an external legal entity with a trustee. And so it ranges. People use this term very loosely, very widely. And so it's not necessarily an actual trust. It can be, but generally speaking, most cities are just using it as the term to have a dedicated fund for affordable housing. I just wanted to mention that the city has a long history around housing. You all probably saw the Winston-Salem Foundation and many entities did reviews around redlining and what redlining means and how that has created issues for certain parts of the community. Many of those communities are still suffering from distressed housing. Areas and neighborhoods have been affected by redlining policies. And so throughout this presentation, just wanted to bring that to your attention and keep that in mind, why certain areas have a heightened need for revitalization and improvement. So where are we now? The current housing need and the market. Due to the surging population, higher rent burdens, and increasing risk of long-term resident displacement, there's just a critical need for new affordable housing. Many of you all hear this number 16,000. That came from a study done by the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Housing Study and Needs Assessment back in December 2018. I just wanted to mention that it's related to rental units. And so as we are trying to create more affordable housing units, I just wanted to note that it quotes, in 2018, fewer than half of all rental units in Winston-Salem are affordable to families earning 80% of area median income or less, resulting in a shortfall of more than 16,000 affordable homes. So that study was referring to rental units. We have our own goal of trying to reach 750. And just to note that many of these renter households are cost burdened, meaning that they spend approximately 30% of gross income on housing expenses. So just bring you up to date what we've done, knowing that we've had this housing shortage of sorts. We have been very fortunate, as many other communities, in receiving ARPA revenue, and we've dedicated quite a few resources specifically for housing. I do want to say this chart, or these charts, are related to ARPA, but we do have home community development block grants. We have other home assistance programs, even for rehab, but this is specifically related to our ARPA dollars. For the ARPA enabled funds, we had about 24 million appropriated for housing. You see the list of projects that were approved by council. Those are the black items. Those are the ones you all approved. The ones in italic, light blue, have not been approved by council, but we have it on our list as in the pipeline. And so remaining, which is that total minus the 24 million, we're looking at about $3 million on the ARPA enabled side. Then we also had some state ARPA funding, and that was $10 million. And so right now we had the flats at Peters Creek that's been approved, and the True Homes developer in the Ridgewood area, we did a land acquisition for that. So if you total everything up, we, in the pipeline and approved, have 847 units. That exceeds our 750 unit goal if we do approve all of these items. And that means a total remaining of uncommitted ARPA dollars would be $6.7 million. Of course, right now it's more than that, but if everything's approved on this page, we'll have at least $6.7 million remaining. So, as I mentioned before, we went to or visited or had Zoom meetings with a few cities. Asheville was one of the first cities that we talked to about their housing fund. They created it in 2000. It is a government. It's run internally by city staff, and the city council has oversight of all of the recommendations that are brought forward. Their sources for their fund is general fund and bonds. Their income served is less than 80% of AMI. A minimum of 20 units are affordable, and the home ownership goal is at 100% of AMI. For housing types, it's multifamily, single-family rental, home ownership, manufactured, modular, container homes, tiny homes, and adaptive reuse. Their affordability period is really based on the loan type, so it could be 3 years, 15, 20, or 30 years. Their affordability is maintained through deed restrictions, conditional zoning, and then they're eligible applicants. Anyone can be from nonprofit, for-profit, state and local government. And then per project caps is less than 10% of total direct costs, and is higher for home ownership. Funding types are acquisition and rehab, construction, permanent, and down payment assistance is the types of funds that people can access. And their priorities are permanent affordability. They're unique in that space. And then they target less than 30% AMI. Their goals are more density, and they do have a priority for green, energy efficient units. They have a $300 application fee. Charlotte, we did actually physically go to Charlotte. They have an amazing staff there. They're doing some great work in Charlotte. They created their trust fund in 2001. It's also government, city staff. They have an appointed housing advisory board, but their city council ultimately makes the decisions. Their funds are GO bonds and federal funds. And theirs is pretty significant. I meant to add to this. I mean, they're doing like 50 million every other year in bonds. So they have a huge pot. The income serves is less than 80% of the AMI, includes 20% at 30% AMI. Multifamily, they also do NOAA, which is naturally occurring affordable housing. They do a lot of partnerships with the county because of that, because counties do a lot of rehab. So they've gotten a lot of support in being able to create affordable housing through preservation. And then they also do supportive housing. So I won't go through all of this, but they do have a cap per request of $3 million. They do gap financing, and they don't have a application fee. What we didn't talk to when we were there, but me and the housing development staff met with CHOAF, and this is the Charlotte Housing Opportunity Investment Fund. I didn't really realize there was a separate entity, but they have a separate entity that they do work with the city of Charlotte. This entity is non-government and it is private. They started in 2019. LISC is the entity that manages this fund. And so this originated through philanthropy. There's these foundations that are on board, banks, healthcare, that all just had an interest in the community and wanted to make sure Charlotte had affordable housing and to reinvest back into the community. So they started this on their own through a foundation, and then did an RFP and enlisted LISC to come on board to manage the funding. And so income served, 90% of the units are created by CHOAF will be homes for families earning 80% or less of AMI. That's pretty consistent. And 25% of those units are reserved for households making at or less the 30% AMI. So pretty much the same housing types, both for-profit, nonprofits can apply. They have a per project cap of $2 million. Also gap financing and loans, and then their same affordability priorities, no application fee. Then we also talked to Wake County, Greensboro, kind of partnership, even Raleigh's, I think, connected to this, but Wake County is connected to Self-Help Ventures Fund. And so we did have a meeting where Self-Help representative came and spoke to you all about what they do and how they assist in leveraging additional dollars. And so they do provide this level of oversight, but their electeds also make final decisions. Self-Help has access to the CRAs through banks, and so they are beneficial in that way, being able to know who to talk to leverage additional funds. So many of the other items are similar to the others. They do have an application fee of $2,500 and is credited towards a 1% loan origination fee. I'll just note that Self-Help, and I'll come back to them, only loans to multifamily projects. So I know there's a growing interest on council to do more single-family homes, but I just wanted to make that note. Self-Help's capital raise would include borrowed funds from banks. That's the CRA credits that I talked about. The interest rate would be a blended rate plus the spread. The spread is the fee to Self-Help. So I know there was a question about how does Self-Help make their money. It is through the spread. So what are the opportunities for Winston-Salem? Some things we have to consider is the administration of the fund. Do we want it to be an internal restricted fund, or do we want it to be a legal trust fund? And there's pros and cons to both. Internally, the fund would be created by our internal staff, and we could reserve it and restrict it for the purpose of affordable housing. We done something like this previously, and I'll mention it in a minute, about Housing Finance Assistance Fund, but it's an internal restricted fund. In the event of a financial crisis, what that does is allow you, there's a dedicated resource to make a different choice. The legal trust fund would be handled totally third party, so that CHOAF, that entity in Charlotte that's privately run, it would be similar to that. It would be more of a legal trust. The council would not be able to unwind in the event of a crisis, and so that money would be pretty much permanently earmarked for affordable housing and managed externally. So we also would need to consider a dedicated funding source. We also need to look at seed funding, and then we also need to discuss third party to leverage the funds. So the dedicated recurring funding sources, there are essentially three potentials. There probably could be others, but I just wanted to note three. Sales tax funding. So this is where the council prior to 2001 set aside 20% of Article 40 local option sales tax distributions for housing purposes. That is the Housing Finance Assistance Fund that you all approved in the downturn of the economy and financial crisis. You all stopped that revenue source coming into the Housing Finance Assistance Fund. It still exists. I think there's some small program income, but essentially there's no dedicated revenue source at this time. So if we chose to do that now, a dedicated sales tax allocation, it would generate approximately $2.9 million that could go to the fund. For property tax is very similar. 1 penny right now on the tax rate would generate about $2.7 million. So it's very close to what the sales tax revenue would generate. And then we could have debt issuance. What I do just want to point out, because I know budget staff's probably shaking back there, when you dedicate sales tax and property tax now, I would say we want to hold that potential decision till budget time, till we see what the forecast of the budget looks like, because that will impact our current level of services potentially if we tie up those resources now for this purpose. It can always be done at a later time, but at least getting through the budget process so that we don't tap those resources. The debt issuance, we talked about a potential 2026 bond referendum, and it could definitely include a housing bond within that. So that is not a recurring funding source unless a plan of future debt obligations is considered. So how will we begin to seed the fund? So to create a fund, you have to have some money to start with. This is just a pure staff recommendation, but we thought we would offer it as an opportunity to consider. We looked at some of our accounting, and there are project balances funded by debt currently, many of which are 2014 bond pots that have been, are just sitting there. And so it's really good to be able to either spend or repurpose these pots, so that then allows you also to issue additional debt. And so while we have debt just kind of tied up and sitting in various pots and holding codes, it becomes a burden financially, number one, to manage, and to then try to issue additional debt. So you can see these are just the titles we have in our budget system of the various codes that we actually have money sitting in, and it's just a range of it. If we use all of these to repurpose it, it still has to be for the purpose of housing, especially the TURN program. We could use that. That would generate $5.9 million that we could then put it in the trust fund pot to create the fund. The mayor has already been in contact with a community partner that is willing to invest $5 million into the fund, and there's another potential investor that may also match that amount. So right now, even without that, we could start the fund with $10 million, almost $11 million, if you all approve a different policy change for the budgeted resources, these pots of money, these really old pots of money that have been unspent. So this is just a chart for Winston-Salem, just a proposal, just based on everything that I just discussed and the other cities of what this could look like in Winston-Salem. And so we would create it within this fiscal year. It would be a government, if that's what you all chose to do. Ideally, staff would recommend an internal restricted fund for the purpose of housing. City staff would manage the fund. the city council would make the decisions about how the funding is spent, kind of like what we do now with gap financing for projects. The source of funds, as I mentioned, community investor, $5 million, repurpose bond funds, $5 million, so that gives us $10 million to start our pot, and then a 2026 bond referendum could also increase that pot. We also have federal funds that we could use to then add to the pot, but I didn't have a number, or that will be a pure policy decision. We could contract with a nonprofit like Self-Help or LISC to then leverage additional funds for our trust fund. Our income served would be less than 80% of AMI. The housing types would be rental, home ownership, and rehab preservation. We already have policies around our affordability period, so that would remain the same. Eligible applicants would be for-profit and non-for-profit, the same that we do now. And you can kind of see gap financing and then the priorities, which you all can decide what the priorities are, but obviously new units, revitalizations, and a focus on distressed neighborhoods, and no application fee. So Mayor Pro Tem, I'll pause there and kind of get you all's feedback on the direction you would like for staff to go from here, or any questions.
Thank you, Interim City Manager Tony. One of the things that I'd like to see is a side-by-side of the cities that we visited, and basically the same matrix, but like where we have, like per project cap is $3 million. And Charlotte and some of the others had that in Asheville, Wake. I'd like to see us lined up as best we can beside each of those.
Okay, I absolutely have that. I just, on the PowerPoint, wanted to make it so you could see it, but I can definitely get that to you today.
Thank you. Councilmember McIntosh, Councilmember Clark.
The listening sessions or interactions that we had with the other municipalities and how they're working on this issue really, I think, kind of blew our minds. I mean, they're producing stuff.
Yeah.
This council, since over the last 7 years, we have ranked affordable housing as our top priority. The hearts and minds of city council are with it. We just haven't been able to produce it. The folks, the outside agencies like LISC and Self-Help, they're not recreating the wheel. They already do this. They have the expertise, and they have the, as an elected official, as a city staff person, there's a risk tolerance. As a developer, you have a different risk tolerance. We're just not able to take on projects that private industry is going to do, or somebody who's outside of our organization. Between the time that we got our funding from ARPA, we've seen our ability to purchase housing decrease dramatically, the number of units. So as time goes by, our ability to actually affect housing is eroding on a daily basis. So the speed at which an outside organization could react is much faster than ours. I just see lots of upside, very little downside. This council will be able to put together what our policies are and say to whatever this group is, okay, here's our priority. We're going to put money in this fund, but here's how you can use it. So I still think we have a fair amount of control over it, but we take the day-to-day out of it. And we don't have to learn the business. We go to somebody who knows the business and can effectuate things.
Thank you. Councilmember Clark, then Councilmember Larson.
First off, conceptually, I like this. I did not make all the meetings. I made some of them, and I felt like you've picked the best of the best as far as doing it. One thing to consider, would this have a separate board? And if so, how would they interface with us? Just a comment. Loans versus grants came up. How to deal with that. And I wrote down cap per project. Other people that had a cap, and again, we're not going to make these decisions. These are just the questions I think that need to be raised. And last comment I wrote down, will you please send me the AMI for this county? And I know that's different if it's a 3-person family or 4, whatever. Give me all the numbers, 4 or 5 of them, whatever they are, and what year they're based on. Because 80% of AMI seems to be the starting point. So if we can have that number, that'll go a long ways doing it. And the last one I just raised this as a question. I don't really have an answer or suggestion, but most of these folks are dealing with apartments, multifamily. I haven't seen any good ideas yet of how people are handling single family. And some of them aren't even. I think it was one of them you mentioned was just doing multifamily. But if you could provide any additional information on who is doing single family financing, how they're doing it, it's just a lot trickier than the other. Anyway, I like what you got there. And now I think we got to come up with a list of the 1,000 questions we need to get answered and then start answering them and putting meat on the bones. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Larson, then Councilmember Burke.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Can you scroll back to the page that shows the categories that are being consolidated for purposes of, the $5 million, $5.9 million, I guess, all in all. These are all projects or categories that were established based on a need that was identified at the time. And for some reason, they've not been executed properly, or they haven't seemed to make much difference in the goals that we're trying to achieve. Is this because of staffing? Is this because of priorities have shifted in these categories? Or why do we feel that we can take these monies now and throw them into a different pot? Or would they be in a different pot?
Yes, that's a great question, Councilmember Larson. There's a combination of reasons, specifically for the TURN program. That's the largest pot. Some funds were spent. I saw a memo for 2018 where there was a moratorium on the program because of a backlog of applications for the program. And so I do think some of it was maybe some staffing issues. There's also the eligibility requirement, which may not be as relevant today for most homeowners to be able to apply and qualify. There's some environmental issues that people aren't eligible. If there's environmental, many of these homes have some historic environmental concerns. And so the cap was $45,000 per unit. We keep seeing an increase of need above that now. So there's a host of reasons, especially for the TURN program. I think the guidelines and the criteria were so restrictive to where a lot of people either didn't qualify, but the people who did and applied, there was a backlog that staff never got to. So
what my concern is that, if we have staffing problems currently executing on the programs that we've already established, and then we establish basically a new program that's to be operated by our own staff, do we have the staff capacity currently to fulfill those goals? And, do we need to hire additional people? Is that part of the program's objective here? And if the people out there for us to hire? I mean, I guess I'm a little concerned about us sort of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic here. And whether or not we've got to really change anything ultimately in our ability to execute, even if we change the funding pot that we're drawing from and the method of distributing that money, whether or not we're not going to be better off to take it off and take it away and put it in a consultant's hands, something like.
I think you could do, yes. I think Councilmember McIntosh kind of mentioned a potential external component. It can be done so many different ways. We could manage it in-house. The projects can come before the city council to vote the same way we do now for gap funding. Developers come, they apply, fill out an application, the internal staff assess the application, and then we bring it to the city council. I think we have a decent system in place to do that. I think the more we expand what people can apply for that will determine how much more staff we would need to support that. I think having a third-party component of some sort, even if we manage the fund internally, and when I say manage, that it resides with our CFO, it resides in-house, so that you all, the city council, would be able to make the decisions. It doesn't mean that we can't also have a third party like self-help to help us manage the funds and give us some guidance and leverage the funds. And actually, probably, I think their pot, now that I'm thinking about it, might be external, but we can have a consultant and an administrator over the fund. But just keep in mind that self-help is only loans to multifamily. So when we start using external entities, we are restricted to their rules.
I think that's important. My second part was and these are designed basically for large development projects, large developers coming in. I want to know how the individual homeowner is going to access any of this money, and where does that fit into the puzzle here?
Right, and so we will continue to work with individual homeowners. We are, as you know, partnering with the county for rehab now, and so we're going to see how that works kind of through a 3-year program where they're tapping into home funds. So we have several funds that actually support housing. So our home funds can be used for rehab, CDBG funds can be used for rehab. So you won't see those pots on here. We still have those funds come in from federal government, and at least for the home portion, and I think a little bit of CDBG, we will allow the county to administer that for Winston-Salem for now. So in meantime, we still have a rehab team. They are assessing existing applications and some loans that we need to clean up. So there's still a lot of work to be done by our internal staff. This would be something totally new. And so we are developing out our housing development department. Right now we have Tanya Skillman, and she stands almost as the lone individual in that space. And so depending on the strategic direction that you all give us today, we will flush out those details and we'll bring back a resolution and a plan on how this would look going
I
forward.
think if I could add one more thing, Madam Chairman.
Yes, Councilmember Locke.
The TURN program intention was noble, and it was designed to go down to the very working level of the wards and everything, and it never achieved that goal. I hope that as we look at this program, that we're making sure that the individual homeowner in this city has access to improvement of their homes. And so as we develop this, I'd like to see how that's going to incorporate into this. I do think that there's some advantage in putting the thing in self-help hands or somebody like that would allow us to do massive projects. I think ultimately let's meet our goals, at least for apartment dwellings. For individual housing, I agree with Councilmember Clark. I don't know that we found a way yet to deal with homeowners other than rehab, which is what we should be doing for sure. Mm-hmm. But thank you.
I'll mention, Mayor Pro Tem, if I can, one more point about Charlotte. What we saw in Charlotte is that they had a great scoring and point system that did take a lot, and they actually had a very small staff. I mean, like 2 or 3 people that were doing all of the work. And that's because they did a lot of work on the front end. So they had great data, technology. The developers could go on their website and actually see how they scored based on the location of the town, what the priorities are. So actually you could get more points in certain areas. It could be distressed areas. It could be areas where there was very little to no affordable housing. And so the developer knew how they can increase their score, and so they would complete the application, they would know what their score is, and if they got tax credit, they almost, especially 9% tax credits, that put them way at the top. So we can create a system where it's easy. People don't have to guess how they can access this particular pot of funding and resources, then also makes it easier on staff to process application and the work.
Thank you. Councilmember Burke, then Councilmember Scipio.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Councilmember Larson actually asked two of the questions that I have. One was about the turn money, and I'm just really concerned. 2014, and we have not used it. And I see it says all wards. I'm interested in the Northeast Ward. Can you tell me where in the Northeast Ward, and give me a little more history about that?
Yes, Councilmember Burke. The Northeast Ward, I think originally they were like 800,000 earmarked, but it was for Greenway, Glen Avenue and North Winston. So there actually was only 5 wards that were part of the TURN program, and that was a priority 1. So they're actually, let me see, make sure. Okay, so those were the neighborhoods that were priority 1 for TURN.
For the
For
Northeast
Northeast Ward.
Ward.
I believe we just got a map that showed all the ones for the city.
There's a map.
Yeah, why don't you send it to everybody again? I didn't mean to interrupt, but
Yeah.
there's a map that shows it.
So these areas in the Northeast Ward, I would like to use the TURN money for the purpose that it was set aside in these specific areas right here. Because I've been trying to focus on distressed areas in the Northeast Ward. And this TURN money is greatly needed right here. And I don't want to take away from a community or some communities that money has been set aside for the purpose of focusing on distress and put it somewhere else. We're not in that position where we can just do that. Not in the Northeast Ward. We might be somewhere else, but not in the Northeast Ward. And the other question that Councilmember Larson brought up that I was going to ask about, whether or not we have the staff and capacity to do this in-house, and you did answer that very thoroughly. And I think when you showed the information Charlotte does in-house, and you said that they did a lot of pre-planning and they were ahead of the game. If we need some assistance, we can always try to get some assistance, but for as much as possible, I believe we need to be in total control. And I think that one point you made when you gave the pros and the cons for both, if we do this in-house, if anything happens and we have to repurpose money, then we can. And I just believe we would be in a better situation if we manage this, and you just said that we can. I heard that. Let's see. I wrote some other stuff down. The suggestion I want to make as we try to use this opportunity, and that's what we're talking about, an opportunity to create affordable housing. I want us to look at affordable housing throughout Winston-Salem and not just in a concentrated location in Winston-Salem. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Burke. Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I just have some basic questions. Some of us on the council had information before. They've been noodling over it a while, and this is my first time seeing all of this data. But I do have a question, just for clarification, just say if I'm right or wrong. The application fee that's charged, is that for developers who pay that application fee when they come to get some funds? For ours, I know you're saying no, but in the other cities, is it for developers?
The only one was, I think it was Asheville had a $300 fee. I would need to see how they actually use it. I need more research to see.
That was just trying to figure out what was it, application for funds from the trust fund. We've talked about the need for staff to manage this. I'm concerned, along with Councilmember Larson and Councilmember Burke, because we often hear our staff can't take on anything else because we are understaffed. So I certainly wouldn't want us to take on something else that will also deplete our resources or not. So I'm curious about how we really look at implementing this. I am assuming, and I guess when you come down to the dollars, there are no ARPA funds going to this fund. Is that correct?
That's correct. Doesn't mean that it can't.
That it can't be.
That's right.
But right now, it's not
Right now, I'm just not showing a proposal. Yeah,
Okay.
but it absolutely could.
Okay. I think it's a great discussion to have also with Councilmember Clark, whether these will be loans or if there'll be grants, and what is that grant based on, and what would a loan be based on. I'm more concerned about not using those TURN funds, because a lot of it went to the East Ward. And I think that we need to revisit that because they were for blighted areas or areas that needed some support, some rehab, and they still need that rehabbed, whether it was executed well or not. We really shouldn't have a program that we say, oh, we just didn't get to it because we had staff turnover or whatever. I think that was a commitment we made, and we certainly should look at that commitment because our neighborhoods still need support, and we need it for both investor owners and owner-occupied homes I know in the East Ward that still need it. Importantly, I really want us as a council, this is one approach, another toolbox we can have on housing. But I would love for us to have a vision of what we want housing to be like in this city and what's going to be the priority. Are we going to commit to preservation? Are we going to commit to rehab? Are we just going to fund new housing? Are we going to commit to owner occupancy? I'm an advocate for that because we know what redlining did. We also know what urban renewal did in our neighborhoods. We need to be looking holistically at how we're going to deal with housing and have a plan that this whole council can support. Otherwise, we are not going to lift the 40,000 households of poor people by building more rental property because it doesn't lift them up financially. And so I would strongly urge that we come together and have a vision for housing in this city, not just coming up with, here's a good idea if somebody else has done. There are more dynamics here that we need to speak to and discuss and come up with a plan for Winston-Salem. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Mundy, then Councilmember Taylor, Councilmember McIntosh.
Thank you for the presentation. I think we need to do things that will allow us to move as quickly as possible. I do agree we want to have a vision, but unless we can get that next week, we've got to start moving. We're behind, and not just on a commitment, but what's happening. All these other cities are going to take all of our potential workforce, folks who could come into our community. We're not keeping up with our competitors. And if we, at any point in time, we don't realize that Durham and Greensboro and Charlotte are competitors, where are those big banks now? So that's really key, that we have to have housing available, and we're already behind many other communities. Would you clarify something for me? You talked about the mayor having some investors. Did you actually mean donors? Mm-hmm. Okay, so they're not investing to get any return on.
No, that's
okay,
right.
Donors. The other thing I want us to make sure to do is to survey, meet with, whatever we need to do with the developers. You know, they're the ones who have to navigate these waters. They're the ones who've been held up, and they're the ones who can push us forward. So whatever we decide, it's not just what works for us, it's what works for them as well. So do we have a plan in place to get that input from developers?
Absolutely. There's always an opportunity to talk to developers. Tanya Skillman and I meet with developers, MPT and Councilmember McIntosh have been meeting. And of course, Councilmember Burke. So developers, they've been reaching out. And they've been having these conversations about kind of where they are, what some of their ideas are around development, and then what their needs are and funding sources. So it's kind of a partnership. We try to help them tap into resources, learn a little bit about the housing tax credits and ways they can get their costs down, and then come back to us as a last resort for gap financing. There's other ways that we can be a partner, such as land donation, conveyance of land that helps them with their costs. So we haven't had a huge session per se where we invite developers in who are interested in learning. It's been really one-on-one because they just range in size. Some of them are just individuals, some are full companies. They're the Walmarts of developers. And so they obviously a lot of times get their costs much lower, especially for multifamily. You'll notice the cost per project cap I have on the proposal is a little bit higher than our normal cost per door for single family. It's just the cost of labor, construction, and equipment is going up for single family. So single family, if that's going to be a new priority, we may need to look and consider. That comes from developers who are saying there's a need. Multifamily, we could stick to the $30,000 per door gap financing. And so there's a lot of decision points. What we can do is start the funds with the seed funding and then flush out through committees, through community development, through finance, what that looks like, right? Staff can hear what you all have said today and start flushing out some of those details and then bring you back a proposal to support it. So it doesn't have to happen. We can start the fund ASAP, and then before we start dispersing those funds, that takes some time. I mean, even if we contract with self-help, they've said I think it's going to take at least 6 months from the time it gets approved to them being able to kind of get up our contracts, everything in order for them to be up on the ground running, and then to start trying to leverage additional funds for us. So it's kind of probably a 3-phase approach: creating the fund, whether it's internal, external, what type of resources do we add to the fund, and then how do we plan to fund it going forward. Then we have to determine how do we disperse the funds and what mechanisms do we need in place for that.
Thank you.
Councilmember McIntosh.
First, I want to say this is the first time that I have seen this information. It's the first time that anybody on council has seen this information, so no one's had a head start on this data. Second is, I want to talk about what Councilmember Mundy and another situation that Councilmember Burke has dealt with. Developers tell us constantly that it's tough to do business here because there's a sliding set of rules. Things change, the goalpost changes, and that's because most of the approval process is done by this group, and we don't all agree on what needs to be done. So we're known as a tough place to do business if you're a developer who wants to do affordable housing. We are not viewed as a trusted partner, to be honest.
Correct.
There are entities and individuals who will put money into a structure that doesn't exist currently, that will never give us money. They will not write checks if we're going to continue to do the housing the way we're doing it. We've had 7 years since we've said housing is our highest priority to come up with our vision and have our conversations. I don't think if anybody on this council is happy with the pace of production of housing, I'd like to know it, because it has been abysmal. All right, we are falling further and further behind. Winston-Salem has the highest rate of increase for both rental and purchase prices for housing of any city in the state.
Yep.
Right, so we are not doing a good job. That's why this needs to go to an outside entity. Like Greensboro has a great model where they funnel the vast majority of their development dollars to self-help. And when I say self-help, I'm almost talking about a generic term. We're going to go out for RFQ. We're going to see who provides the best. I hope we are. Who provides the model that we like the best. But they also have a sort of a parallel track that allows some funding to be allocated by city council. Right, and so to me, that is a good model. Councilmember Burke, I know you've met with a bunch of developers, and you've been told over and over again that no, our criteria aren't met or whatever, we need to hook all those people who come to us, we need all of them building as many units as we can. We need to build rental, we need to build for home ownership across the board. We were 16,000 units short when that study was done. We have fallen further behind, right? We have not kept up. The TURN program, as a concept, I love it. It doesn't work. It's unmanageable. It never produced the results that it was supposed to produce because it's Byzantine. If you look at the program and you want to get money, it's really difficult. And so I believe in the concept of it, but it's really hard to do on the ground. And what we need to start doing is doing stuff on the ground, not in theory. We need to practice what we preach. We need to build houses. We need to make it as easy as possible for developers to come in, build units, and hand keys over to people. That's our constituency that we are not currently serving by doing the things the way we've been doing them since I've been on council.
Thank you. Councilmember Clark.
Just briefly, I want everybody to understand that TURN's been around a while, and I think that pot was a lot bigger several years ago, maybe to the tune of $6, $7, $8 million in it, but it has been used, and it was, what was it before TURN?
That was it.
It was something else.
Yeah.
Started as TURN.
It started
Oh, it's TURN, okay, well.
transforming
We've had
urban
several,
residential
yeah.
neighborhoods.
Anyway, because I know, for example, Ms. Burke, in your ward, those buildings right across the street from the dairy,
That was RUCA.
that was RUCA.
Different pot.
But again, that was a different pot, but there have been several pots of urban renew housing, whatever type funds. Second one, be careful on the big givers. My understanding is most of those are loans, not donations. And one reason that some of these other folks have only pots of money that are loan pots is because the big givers have given that money. Now, they may only want 1 or 2% return, but it's my understanding that, and you know who the big guys are in town, are looking for a return, not a loan. And the last one, I just mentioned this, is and I'm going back to my single family. One of the keys to single family is you've got to come up with companies that will write mortgages to individuals. I expect everybody in this room owned a house at one time, and you put a down payment down, and you usually took a mortgage for the difference. Sometime there was maybe another little slice in there where Uncle Joe lent you a little bit of money, your parents or whatever. But I think the big key to home ownership is finding several financial institutions that will do loans in the area that we want them to, and I just offer that as a challenge. But anyway, I think we've had some excellent comments tonight.
Thank you, Councilmember Clark. Councilmember Monday.
No.
Councilmember McIntosh.
I get them confused.
Just quickly, I'm going to say that there are lending institutions that really want to participate here locally, and they're local institutions, which is great. But until there's a group, until there's an administration that's going to run this effectively, they will not participate. I've spoken to them. Our ability to get CRA money from the big banks is, it's just not there. We stand to really up that game if we have a self-help or a LISC who's actually running things.
Thanks. I agree with a lot of what's been said. But as Councilmember McIntosh and Clark and Councilmember Taylor, this council did not get in the game of housing or thinking about housing as we know it now until 2017 or 16. And that was a hard push back then. Everybody thinks that's a long, but that was a push. Because the studies that we use or we refer developers and others to, if you look at the dates of when these studies were published, they're all around 2017, 2018, 2019. And that data, even though may not be accurate now, but it's basically the same if you use a multiplier to get you there as to how many houses that we need, how much we need. I think, again, that we're on a good path. I'm not a patient person. Everybody knows that about me. I'm the person that moved the rock and stone people away, to get them going, the solid people, because you can't keep just, stuck. You can't be stuck. You've got to keep moving because the world is changing every day. The development of the process, this is the beginning, as Ms. Tony knows. The process has to be developed, whether that's the city attorney's office, the interim city manager, the housing and community development, and the council. Because until we send out something that says, like we do a list of things, give us your priority. Which ones of these are you most interested in to get for? That's how we got to making housing our priority. You gotta give people suggestions, but then you gotta let them pick and choose, because if we don't, we will be just where we are now. The revisiting to turn. Costs have gone up, everything's gone up. And that 2-point-something million is good, but for me, since we're just saying our thoughts, I think the pot that you showed us, the possibilities, it's not in stone, but I think it's a very good place to start. These are funds that some of my colleagues and I voted on years ago, and yes, it started out okay, but again, things started to change. And so those monies were left untouched and unused. We're not saying that we won't use them, but as you said, Ms. Tony, what we're trying to do in our trust fund is not only about home ownership and home rental, it's about rehab and preservation. And if all of us would go back and look at for everyone's home study, that was the priority. Preservation and rehab was the priority of that particular study. So if you don't have it, ask staff to get you a copy or go online and read it. The money. As we've all seen, again, these other cities have started long before we have. We really should have started around 2015 or something after they started, when some of us started talking about a housing trust fund. As Councilmember McIntosh said, and he knows, I've met with Wells Fargo and Truist and other smaller banks who are really wanting to get in the game. That's one of the things Charlotte told us. Smaller banks are willing to get in the game quicker than major banks. If we could just get this started, this housing trust fund, it will be a huge benefactor to the city of Winston-Salem, because business has changed and they need to see things that everybody else is doing, and everybody else is doing housing trust funds and other entities similar to that. We're gonna need to make some policy changes, and I know how that does and goes with the council. Tough decisions demand tough action, tough leadership. You all have to understand, we can put all of this in a pot and cook up a great stew, but if we're not willing to make some policy changes, make it easier for people to want to do business with us. I admire and respect our citizens, but if we fold and don't create the business climate environment that this city needs to build housing, to be able to get businesses to come here and want to live, said in a meeting today, whereas if we don't start pulling people from the middle of the state west to this east to this side, then we're going to lose. The housing cost in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Orange, those areas, young people, they can't afford that. They don't mind driving 2 hours to work. They are wanting to move to Greensboro, Winston, High Point, and we got to be prepared and ready to bring them here. This is not going to be, again, I'm all in full effect mode now. It's countdown. Either we are going to walk it or we're just going to talk it all the time. I've been on the Community Development Housing General Government since 2009. I am the longest serving member of this council. And I have been pushing housing. Councilmember Taylor will tell you that. Councilmember Clark will tell you that. And Councilmember McIntosh. I have been pushing housing since I've been on this council. That's always been my priority. I just had to get everybody else kind of up to speed. We've done enough training. We've done enough discussion. We've had enough studies. It is now time to act. And I will be looking for all of you to do just that. Ms. Tony and staff will provide all of the necessary information that you need, any studies that we've done. They will help you. You know, I know our staff is limited and busy and short, but they are willing to move on this just as quickly as we are. But it's not them totally that's holding us up. As my bosses used to say, they draw an arrow on the paper, and when I'm in there complaining about an issue, they draw an arrow and then point it to me and say, go do something. I'm asking all of you to go do something. And let's be more in the moment of where we need to be if Winston-Salem is even going to be sustainable in trying to provide housing for the future of the city and for the people that live here now. Are there any comments from interim city manager Tony?
No, I just need some direction. Direction will help the staff from today move forward with developing and fleshing out the plan. I took some notes on all of your comments around around external versus internal. I would like to have a general consensus if you want to keep it an internal fund, and then we can work some things out. External fund, it could be an internal fund that has a third-party nonprofit managing it. It can be an external fund. I'll say the external, there's the model for CHOA is purely external, right? I mean, it's
A lot of money.
It's right. There's privately owned and regulated, and the people at the table actually add to the pot. So that's a different model. We would have to get people on board that can contribute to the pot. So it's hospitals, foundations, and things like that. Internally, we would have to determine our ongoing revenue source and then maybe get a third-party entity.
Can I ask a question?
Councilmember McIntosh, Councilmember Scipio, then Councilmember Clark.
I'm hesitant to put a proposal forth that shows a real specific structure. We have a new city manager coming in. I think we owe it to him to have some wiggle room for him to
To
advise. I think a general direction here is to create one. The exact specificity of that, I think, can be determined later. That's my thought.
Councilmember Scipio, Councilmember Clark.
I know this is just another tool to help us get to housing. I'm concerned about, is $10 million enough? If we had that fund, how much investment would come off of it? How many, just how, it's how we manage it, but is it enough for us to make a dent towards the number of housing units we need to have?
Well, that's why we would need someone that can leverage the additional dollars on our behalf of the city. We have a little time to get the funding at a level we're comfortable with, and as I mentioned, you can have a 2026 bond. You could really do 20 million if you wanted to for housing bonds that could really add to the pot. From now until 2026, we still have ARPA dollars that are uncommitted that we still are able to provide gap financing for. So I don't see us actually dispersing funds within the next 6 months. We would need time to get this fund set up, the seed money committed. Like I said, I think the mayor has a few other opportunities to add to the pot, the initial seed funding. So that is a great question, and that's where our cost per project, a cap, will come into play so that we can make sure the most people can have a bang for their buck for these resources.
And one more thing before I get to Councilmember Clark. That's another thing that needs to be part of it is the notice of funding, the call, the notification, as like Charlotte and everybody else has done, that we need a call period, a timeline of if we do one in the fall, let's say September, October, and then we do one in the spring or January, February, whatever, before budget, it's got to fall in a way that we are able to take in these requests for funding and gap. And they shouldn't all be coming to us at one time, and they shouldn't all be coming to us all over the place. And I understand that council members like to advocate, but we can no longer keep running this business like that. A real business, the Fed and everybody in these other cities, you have a time that you can put in as a developer, nonprofit, whatever, could be December, that you now have a deadline, December 31st, to put in that you want gap funding. Then mid-year, we take another one. But it's gotta be in a controlled environment, and I'd like to see that. Councilmember Clark.
Ms. Adams has handed me a motion. I'm going to do it as a recommendation, not as a motion.
Okay.
That I think we need to direct
Should've kept-
staff to interview each council member individually and come back to the October
16.
General Government Committee
16th.
with a detailed, can I call it a skeleton type proposal of what you've come up with. And I think we all have little ideas that we would like to add. You had a good one on the how much money and leverage and this, that, and the other. And we can, and what I'm envisioning, that thing will put a lot of meat on the bones and kind of be very specific. I think you got the start of it here, but I would, if that's okay with you, interview everybody, let's, get everybody's input, and then let's be prepared to see a specific item in October, knowing that the new city manager will be here in November, and I think things might fall in place. Understand that we still have a lot of projects that are, and you showed them at the very beginning, that have been funded and that are moving forward. Yep. If that's okay with you, Ms. Adams.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Burke.
Two things. Number one, if we move forward and we're going to be interviewed right now, my position is for the TURN money that's been set aside for the Northeast Ward to be removed from this list. And also, if we have banks who are willing to support housing in Winston-Salem, is there an opportunity to have conversations with them, the council, to find out what it is they distrust about the council and what policies can be changed to encourage them, just in case we decide as a council that we would like for this project to be self-managed by us. Can we have a conversation with the banks as a council to get their support financially as well as bringing it in-house? That's it.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Tony, for an outstanding presentation.
Councilmember Larson. Thank you, Councilmember Burke.
I've been a strong supporter of TURN ever since I've learned of the program, and I continue to support the mission of TURN. What I would direct staff is to look at the mission of TURN and think about how it would be incorporated into this new program, is particularly dealing with the small homeowners or the small investors who are dealing with rehab and preservation, as Council Member Adams talked about. I definitely want to see a strong component of rehabilitation. I remember in the 1980s, we had the Back to the City movement with West End, Washington Park, a variety of neighborhoods, Highland Avenue, came back, and those neighborhoods were revived with reinvestment using HUD money at the time. And I think we got potential to do that in East Winston and various sundry places still to improve the quality of the neighborhoods that would be attractive to anybody looking at this city. So if we could take a look at two tracks, almost one track dealing with a large investor who's going to produce either housing or rental units, but also keeping in mind that we have homeowners that still need help. I'd like to see that incorporated in some way into this discussion, one track, one way, one track the other, perhaps. And I'm very interested in this self-help, and I don't know much about them, and obviously we'll learn more about them as we go along. But I think there's an avenue there, but if they don't do with small homeowners, I'm not going to be very interested in having them take the full amount of money. Thank you.
We're done. We're done. There are no more comments or questions. This meeting is adjourned.